Hey guys, thank you for joining us again. I'm Nunnally, and we're in the middle of a series tracing Joseph's and Mary's steps from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We've already done part one, where we saw Joseph and Mary descend from the Nazareth Ridge and cross the Jezreel Valley, and then part two, where we looked at their journey through what is called Samaria. And today, in part three, we're going to be looking at the last leg of the journey. We're going to get those guys to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus so that we can celebrate Christmas together. There, we're going to be looking at Gibeon and Mizpah. They're kind of one and the same. They're right next door to each other, so we'll count that as one stop. We're going to look at the holy city of Jerusalem and then on to Bethlehem. So let's get started. We move from Bethel, where we left off in segment 2, in session 2, and now we're moving on to Mizpah, which is about 8 miles down the road from Bethel. We've got pictures here for you of Mizpah and also of Gibeon. We'll be visiting both of those by video in just a moment. But I wanted to share just with you just a moment about the deliverance theme that keeps coming up in this journey of Joseph and Mary. The deliverance of God. He brings deliverance, rescue, ransom, salvation, and then also this constant recurring theme of God's promise to be present with His people, present among His people. That is a kind of a factor, a component that shows up in every covenant renewal in the entire Bible, both Hebrew Bible or Old Testament as well as New Testament. And then we're also going to see at Mizpah and Gibeon this recounting or retelling the history of God's redeeming acts on behalf of His people. This is what God does. He redeems, He rescues, He ransoms. And the history, the retelling of that is usually a part of a covenant renewal. And we're going to get that at Mizpah and Gibeon as well. Our passages for this are 1 Samuel chapter 7 as well as 1 Samuel chapter 10. So, we are in now the tribal allotment of Benjamin. This last or third session that we're doing here has to do with Benjamin and Judah. We've finished with Samaria. We've finished with the hill country of Manasseh and the hill country of Ephraim, and now we have moved into the environs of Mizpah and Gibeon. Mizpah and Gibeon, just to give you a point of reference, Mizpah and Gibeon are only about 5-6 miles from the capital city of Jerusalem. So we're just north of Jerusalem, about 5 miles. At Mizpah, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 10, Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah. This is a convocation, a holy moment where Samuel, the prophet and the high priest of Israel, is going to renew the covenant, covenant renewal with the people of God, and he's going to do this at this place called Mizpah, which then makes it into a holy site. And he said to the sons of Israel, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, I brought you up. I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you." There's that theme of deliverance, rescue, ransom, redemption. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians. And then he kind of summarizes, and from the power of all of the kingdoms that were oppressing you. And he brings them up to date. He says, and so because this God has been so covenantally faithful, because He has acted on your behalf to deliver, to ransom, redeem you, now you are to return that covenant faithfulness with covenant faithfulness of your own, a response of faithfulness and obedience. This is kind of covenant renewal classic version that we get here at Mizpah with Samuel in the 10th century BC. By the way, whenever we're talking about covenant renewal, as we've mentioned in the 2 previous segments, We're reminded of the words of the prophet Jeremiah, who is predicting in the 6th century BC, the days are coming when I'm going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel. God's constantly renewing His covenant with His people. This time, I'm going to write it not on tablets of stone, but on their hearts. It's going to become integrated. It's going to be a part of them, and they're going to live it out, and then the covenant blessings will follow covenant obedience. Jeremiah is predicting this, and this is a passage that authors of the New Testament latch onto and apply directly to what God did in the incarnation. When He becomes Emmanuel, God with us, in the form of Jesus, in His birth, life, ministry, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. This is what we're talking about as far as covenant renewal, and every time the covenant is renewed, there's an upgrade in the mix. It gets better and better and better. So keep that in mind as we're continuing with Joseph and Mary, preparing their hearts, preparing their minds for this event where they become part of this story of redemption, and they become intimately involved in this event, the birth of Jesus. Also, at Gibeon, 1 Kings chapter 3, King Solomon, 10th century BC, went to Gibeon to sacrifice there. Now remember, this is okay because the temple hadn't been built yet, and there were high places that were acceptable locations for the worship, not of the pagan gods, but of Yahweh, the God of Israel. So King Solomon went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon. So here's God again, stepping into human history and revealing Himself, divine revelation. And He speaks directly to Solomon, and He says, "Ask whatever you wish me to give you." It's interesting that we've got the same promise, almost exactly the same words uttered by Jesus in John chapter 15. He says, "If you abide in me and I abide in you," that presence of God, "then you can ask what you wish and it will be done for you." So this is like Jesus saying, yeah, in the same way that God met with the great exalted King Solomon, and after 1,000 sacrifices and after a trip to the holy site of the high place of Gibeon, yeah, it's that same God who's going to keep covenant with you. And you, New Testament, John 15, you can ask what you will of God, and God will graciously grant that because He loves to involve Himself in the lives of His people. So let's take a look at the sacred sites of Mizpah and Gibeon, both of which in eyesight Joseph and Mary passed by on their way to Bethlehem. Beautiful imagery here. We're looking at the high place. Notice the hill of Mizpah. This is a combination synagogue and mosque, and a gigantic archaeological excavation there at Mizpah. Now we look across this very narrow valley, and almost a stone's throw from Mizpah is the holy site, that great high place of Gibeon, this mound that is right here. So there's beautiful imagery. Hopefully it's helping you to contextualize. Beyond Gibeon, another 4 or 5 miles to the northeast, this the skyline being dotted by that skyscraper there, that is the modern city in the West Bank of Ramallah. Ramallah reminds us of the city of Ramah, which is in the same area, and that is where the prophet Samuel was lived, and also where he was buried. The location is the biblical site of Ramah. Now, let's move on to Jerusalem. Let's continue on Joseph and Mary's journey, continuing southward, and we move from the area of Gibeon and the area of Mizpah about 4 or 5 miles to the south, and we come to the capital city of Jerusalem. This is the location where David conquered the Jebusite city in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and eventually where Solomon, his son, would build the first temple, the second temple being built much later by the generation of Ezra and Nehemiah. The themes that are involved with Jerusalem are manifold. There's so much that you can do there. So many events take place. Jerusalem's the most often mentioned city in both Old and New Testaments, but we're going to focus on the temple as an expression of the presence of God, that renewed promise, covenant promise that God is going to always keep, and it always connects. It's always there whenever there's a covenant renewal, the promise of the presence of God. And the rule of David and then his son Solomon after him, these rules of these two kings, the second and third king of a united Israel, they sort of become the benchmark for what the Messianic Kingdom would be like. Their rules are practically marked by the imagery and themes of a true Messianic rule. We'll see this in passages that we discuss. Here's a representation of Solomon's temple. There's nothing left of that, and so there's no way we can know exactly, precisely what it looked like, but this is close enough to give you an idea of what the temple of Solomon looked like. The passages that we're going to be looking at are 2 Samuel chapter 7 and also 1 Kings chapters 4 through 7 related to the son of David, King Solomon. So we've moved from Mizpah 5 miles to the south to the capital city of Jerusalem. And this is going to be the subject of this particular segment of our discussion. You'll remember that as far back as the law of Moses, in the Torah, God says, you will seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God shall choose. He's already predicting that there's going to be, among the tribes of Israel, there's going to be a specific location where God chooses to make His dwelling known most powerfully. And that was first Shiloh or Shiloh in the form of the tabernacle, but that then gets incorporated into the temple of Solomon, which he builds at Jerusalem. So the place that the Lord your God shall choose is eventually Jerusalem. And this is out of all of your tribes in order to establish His name there for His dwelling. Again, a reference to this promise of the dwelling of God among His people, His covenant presence. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we hear in the rule of King David, when the king lived in his house, the Lord had given him rest on every side from all of his enemies. This is an aspect of the Messianic Kingdom. When Jesus returns, every knee is going to bow and every tongue is going to confess. All of the enemies will be subdued. The people of God will be exalted. Peace will rule the nations. There will be abundance and bounty. There will be a sense of safety and security. This marks the rule of David. This marks the reign of Solomon as well. And as such, these guys kind of become templates or become exemplars, exemplary rulers of what ultimately the Messianic Kingdom would be like and what the Messianic King would be like as well. We hear also about Solomon, a very similar thing. Solomon had dominion over everything west of the river, and we're talking about the Euphrates River, not the Jordan River. From Tipsah even to Gaza, all the kings west of the river. And he had, listen to this, peace on all sides around about him. So like with David, so also with the son of David, Solomon. Like with David, so also the son of David, Jesus. Peace will mark the rule of all three of these kings. So David and Solomon represent or serve as, they become a shadow or a precursor to these realities that will take full expression when the Messianic era begins under the rule of the Messianic King. He had peace on all sides, and Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, which is an indication of the bounty or the abundance that marks the Messianic rule. Let's take a look at Jerusalem, just to give you a feel for, as though you were almost there, for the city as it existed in David's time, in Solomon's time, and ultimately in Jesus' time. Okay, we are in a helicopter, so it's a little shaky, but you're going to be all right. This is the city of David, this little finger of 6 or 7 acres. This is the Temple Mount, and that's what was added in the days of Solomon. And this is eventually where the Golden Dome is, the Dome of the Rock, is where Solomon built his temple, as well as the temple of the Ezra Nehemiah period and the rebuilt version under King Herod the Great in Jesus' day. This is the Pool of Siloam right here. And this is the Kidron Valley that separates Jerusalem in David and Solomon's day from the Mount of Olives right below us. This entire city, if you can track along the city wall, the city blossoms from 6-7 acres in David's time to over 200 acres in Jesus' day. And you can see the old city stretching out behind what is the Temple Mount, this rectangular shape right here. This is a beautiful picture that stretches all the way up on the horizon to the far right in this area here, all the way to Mizpah and Gibeon, where we were in our previous discussion. So this is, again, presence of God, the temple of Solomon, the temple of the days of Zerubbabel and Ezra, Nehemiah, the temple as it existed in Jesus' day that had been rebuilt and enlarged, beautified by Herod the Great. The promise of God as illustrated by all 2 or 3 temples, the temple of Solomon, the temple of Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the rebuilt, beautified temple of Herod the Great that existed in the days of Jesus. The presence of God, again, connects every covenant in the Bible, both Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, as well as in the New Testament. And this is all preparing, again, as Joseph and Mary travel past Jerusalem on the last leg of their journey, on the way to Bethlehem. They look across the valley. They see the Temple Mount. They see the temple itself, and they are reminded of God's promise and of God's fulfillment of that promise to dwell among His people. What better way to prepare their hearts for the reception of Emmanuel, God is with us, the presence of God, literally in physical form, dwelling among His people. Now let's move on to Bethlehem, the final spot in the journey of Joseph and Mary and our journey as we traveled along with them. The heroes of the faith, Ruth, the Moabitess, Boaz, the godly Israelite, David, King David, who started as a boy born in Bethlehem, and then Joseph and Mary, as well as Jesus Himself. And our themes are going to be God's divine intervention in the affairs of humankind and promise fulfillment. He has promised, He has renewed the promise in form of a renewed covenant, and He fulfills His promises. Our passages that we're going to look at are really the entire book of Ruth that we'll look at in representative fashion. Matthew chapter 2 and Luke chapter 2 that describe the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem. So, Bethlehem from a distance, and then the Church of the Nativity up close and personal. We'll be revisiting both of those visuals in just a moment. So we've moved from Mizpah, Gibeon, past Jerusalem. This is about 5 miles, and then from Jerusalem, another 6 miles to our final destination, Bethlehem. In the book of Ruth, we're told in chapter 4, which is, by the way, borrowed by the gospel writer Matthew in chapter 1, as he's giving the genealogy of Jesus' pedigree. To Salmon was born Boaz. Boaz, and to Boaz, Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse. Jesse is the father of David, and to Jesse is born David. You know, if David had not been born in Bethlehem, Bethlehem would never been much more than a bump on the map. It's a small town, approximately 400 or 500 people, not only in David's day, but about the same size in Jesus' day when he was born there. That's one of the most legitimate parts of A Christmas Carol, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was really a very small village. In the book of Micah, a prophet that was contemporary with Isaiah, 8th century BC, 8 centuries prior to the birth of Jesus, makes this prediction. He's doing it on the basis of the reign of King David. And David was originally living in Bethlehem, born in Bethlehem. Micah looks back at that ideal period, almost messianic period of David and Solomon, and he's thinking about David's birth and early life in Bethlehem. And Micah predicts this: "But as for you, O Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth from me to be ruler in Israel." Now he's not talking about David now. David's already lived and died a couple of hundred years before Micah. Micah's looking forward, and he's looking to the son of David, the Messianic King, the one who will bring real and complete covenant promise fulfillment. And he says, you're going to start out in Bethlehem, but you're going to be ruler in Israel. This one, this Messianic King, his goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. In other words, this is an eternal being, and his coming has been on the way for a long time before he finally gets here in full human form. The Gospel of Matthew picks up on this. And in his genealogy, he talks about the generations from Abraham to David. He's connecting Jesus, this is Jesus' genealogy, to Father Abraham, the progenitor of the entire Jewish, Hebrew, Israelite race. And then he's connecting Jesus to David, royalty, almost messianic rule with the peace, the abundance, etc. that goes with that. And then he talks about until the time of Christ. And then he uses all of that to introduce the narrative of the birth of Jesus. Now, the birth of Jesus was as follows, and he proceeds to tell about this beautiful story, Matthew chapter 2, about the early life of Jesus in Bethlehem as the son of David. So here's a picture of the outskirts of Bethlehem, cascading down the hill, and beautifully, we have the reason for the name Bethlehem. Right here in the foreground, we have a newly plowed field. That should strike you as odd because we're in the Judean hill country. And in the Judean hill country, the slopes are so difficult to farm that they're only used for olives and for grapevines and almond trees and the like. They're not typically plowed. You don't get row crops. You don't get grains grown in the Judean hill country, but Bethlehem is unique. It's on somewhat of a plateau. It's relatively flat around Bethlehem, and so it comes to be known as the place of bread, a place where wheat can be grown. Wheat can be harvested, ground, and then baked into bread. So this little village of 400 or 500 people becomes known as the place of bread because of the kind of agriculture that was possible there, but relatively unique in the Judean hill country. Let's take a look at the little town of Bethlehem. This is some drone footage that will tell you how big Bethlehem is now. It's not a little town anymore. We have about 30,000, almost 30,000 inhabitants of Bethlehem. It's choked by buildings and small alleyways and even streets that are difficult to navigate. It's an interesting experience to visit there. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. But this is a picture of modern day Bethlehem. We're going to move on from there to the ancient Bethlehem that was on this knob of the hill. And in the middle of that, here we have Manger Square and the approach to the Church of the Nativity that marks the spot where Jesus was born. And this then cross-shaped basilica goes all the way back to the Byzantine period, the late Roman Empire. So this is a very, very early church built by the mother of Constantine the Great. Her name was Queen Helena. And what a beautiful shot that then shows us not only Manger Square and the Church of the Nativity, but also to the end of modern day Bethlehem and the beginning of this part of the Judean wilderness. Beautiful picture. Here's a close-up of the same. Here we have Manger Square where the cars are parked, and this is where you get the broadcast on Christmas Eve from Bethlehem, Manger Square, and then the approach to the church, a small door where you have to bend down, enter the church, and this is the Church of the Nativity, the location marked by church early tradition, as well as the building of the church as being the spot where Jesus was born. Here's another video where we will fly through this part of town. You'll notice the spot, Syrian Orthodox Church here, the Church of Manger, Nativity Square, Manger Square there, the approach to the Basilica, and then the Church of the Nativity itself, and again looking off into the distance of the Judean hill country. You know, if Jesus is born here and only 30 years plus later, he ends up tempted in this very wilderness by the enemy, the adversary, Satan, the devil, and that forms that's a formative moment in his life that prepares him for his messianic ministry of approximately 3 years. Well, you know, we've looked at a lot of different themes that Mary and Joseph encountered on this 60-mile-long trip by foot from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We've traveled along with them, and we have seen some major instances, important moments of God's divine intervention in human history, in the affairs of men. We've also seen God delivering His people time after time after time. He is a God who delights to redeem, to rescue, to ransom, to deliver His people. We've also seen how this constant renewal of the covenant and the promise and the fulfillment of God's dwelling among His people is developed as we've gone from spot to spot. And these are things that Joseph and Mary are being reminded of over and over again to prepare their hearts and minds to become a part of that story. We've seen where the history of redemption is told and retold as God then renews His covenant with His people, reminding them of His faithfulness and of the importance of their response back to God of faithfulness and obedience on their part. We've seen over and over where God has revealed Himself and where He's speaking to Samuel the prophet, etc. And this is another important component of their preparation. God's going to reveal Himself yet again. And yet, yes, it will be an upgrade. It always gets better with God. We never go backward. We're always going forward. And example after example along this long 60-mile journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem of God revealing and desiring to communicate, to have fellowship with, and to reveal Himself to His people. We've also looked at how God is faithful to fulfill His promises. They don't drop to the ground. He is good to His word. He's going to keep His covenant irrespective of what happens. He is faithful, and because of that, He's a God that we can trust. Lastly, we've looked at Messianic rule, how that was revealed through David and through Solomon, and they sort of become an example, a template, a shadow of what would eventually become the Messianic rule of King Jesus. Well, you know, I'm sure that this is a Christmas list that is daunting I mean, it's incredible, yes? I guarantee you it prepared the hearts of Joseph and Mary for them to take their place in God's history of redemption, of redeeming a people to Himself. And when they got to Bethlehem, they had been to Sunday school. They had been to home Bible study. They had been to home fellowship. And they had gotten the message. The message is, all of these messages, again and again and again, repeated, so it would get down into their heart and have them ready for this most important revelation of God in all of history, Emmanuel, God with us. Well, I know that it prepared their hearts. I trust that it will have prepared your heart for you to take your place in God's history of redemption. Merry Christmas.